So hello and good afternoon to all participants at Peatlands Gathering 2021. Thank you for coming back after the break. My name is Pat Fitzgerald from the Irish Peatland Society and I'll be chairing this session. The session consists of 5 presentations that in one sense are quite diverse in terms of subject matter, but I suppose that reflects the conference overall. For a start, Seamus Caulfield will present the story of the Cage of Fields, which I think Seamus would forgive me for saying he's synonymous with, and it's probably more prehistory than history, but I'm sure it'll be interesting. This will be followed by Mike Long telling us about peat landslides, or so-called bog slides. Then we have a joint presentation from Derek McLoughlin, Paddy, Crushell and Colm Gavin on peatland restoration and the Common Agricultural Policy, or CAP. Shirley Clarke from Monaghan County Council will introduce a people dimension to peatland management, as well as the climate and nature aspects. And in the final presentation of the session, Andrew Jackson will deal with the legal framework for peatlands. So although the session is not themed, so to speak, it is mostly concerned with various land aspects of peatlands. So look, without further ado, over to Seamus Caulfield. Seamus is UCD, and the title of his presentation is Turbary and Archaeology. And I'll ask Seamus now to introduce himself.
Gur Michael Pattergus, Gur Michael Socton Corrow Lorchinshire and you. My name is Seamus Caulfield, retired Professor of Archaeology in UCD. But more than that, because of the work that I've been doing over the last half century, a native of Balderrick, which is in the background to the slide which is shown here. In the foreground is Cage of Fields. And just referring to the last speaker about fundraising, I'd point out that over 30 years ago in '89, when we were, as a community, raising funds for Cage of Fields, a private operation, the Connacht Gold Co-op, gave £50,000 on that occasion to the project. So there was a lot of local community input into it. Also, hundreds of students, some of whom are speaking here today and have spoken, who worked with me on the Cage of Fields over a very long time. But what I want to talk about is Turbary and some of the positives that come from Turbary and the archaeology, in particular Cage of Fields and Balderrick, where I grew up. And I already have a problem here in that I'm not moving the slides. Slides are not moving on. The slide.
If you just use the arrows on your keyboard, that should work.
That's what I'm using.
Try the mouse.
Try hit return, Seamus, would that work?
Yes. There's nothing happening on it.
If you go down to the bottom left with your mouse, you'll see there's a little arrows there.
And the
Working now.
Turbary, I want to talk about Turbary, where people cut the turf, and in the scene of Cage of Fields, looking in from the Cage of Cliffs, you can see where people have cut the turf. And in cutting the turf, things like megalithic tombs turn up on the soil underneath, obviously predating the growth of the blanket bog which was formed around it. But not just megalithic tombs like that, but ordinary mundane structures like stone walls showed up in this bog at Cage of Fields. And that allowed us, because people had cut the turf, it was literally millions of pounds worth of free excavation was carried out, and it allowed us to map what was a very extensive Neolithic field system at the time, showing very large, very extensive fields. We now know that those are dairy fields. The milk residue has been found in the pottery which was excavated on the site. But our problem was that the walls disappeared into the deep uncut bog, and Turbary was never going to expose what was there. But we found that by probing with iron probes, such as people used one time to find trees under the bog, and bamboos to mark the profile of where the walls were, we were able to follow up the walls, as I say, with hundreds of students, but also with my 13-year-old son here in 1987 on the top of KG Hill, showing the profile of the ground, first of all, marked by the bamboos, and then the profile of the wall. And 30 years later, his son, Flynn, is working with me still on Cage of Fields. And this has allowed, over the years, it has allowed what was the Cage of Fields in the top left-hand corner of the screen. It allowed us to expand the fields into the uncut bog and over a very extensive area of over 4 square miles, actually, of enclosed fields, which we now know are dairy fields. But what I want to, that is the summary of the last 50 years of work. What I want to look at is the potential of the Turbary, continuing Turbary. And I would like to say this is our bog, but I would like to say that I'd cut this turf, but anyone would have noticed who knows anything about turf cutting would have noticed that I was cutting left-handed, whereas this turf was cut by an excellent turf cutter, throwing up the first top as we cut the bog in Mayo, throwing it onto the about 2 meters in from the edge, and then the second top, the middle top there, being left up neatly on the top, almost like you can see at the back of my library shelf, and at the back of Pat as well, volumes of a journal, of a scientific journal, piled up on the top of the bank. And I use that term particularly because every one of those sods is a volume that contains 1,500 years of history, contains 1 billion bits of botanical information, possibly contain in all the pollen that is there, and contains possibly the volcanic dust from Hecla, 750 miles out just to the north over the open sea. But what I want to refer to now is not so much the past as the future, what I see as the ongoing research which needs to be done in places like Cage of Fields and at Balderrig. And there are just 3 things I would like to deal with. One is that in those sods of turf, in those volumes, and in that bog itself, there are billions and billions of grains of pollen. And one of the dominant species on the surface of the blanket bog is Mollinia. And the problem with Mollinia is that the size of the pollen grains extend above 40 microns, and they overlap with the pollen of cereal. And one of the things that needs to be looked at is to see what percentage of the pollen of the Mollinia exceeds 40 microns, because there is the danger that in some places a deserted blanket bog would actually be peopled by a confusion between Mollinia and cereal, the pollen of cereal which overlaps with it. The other thing I want to refer to—
2 minutes remaining, Seamus.
The other thing I want to refer to are the roots. We now notice, as I still cut my turf, this is our bog, and not cut by me when this slide was taken a few years ago. But I now notice that on the bottom of the bog, when we cut the last top and come to the mineral soil, that while the last top is a gunge of totally decayed plants, that there are roots, intact roots, now in the soil, on the iron pan underneath it, but in particular on the surface of any stones that are there, and that there needs to be a study of those roots, and can we identify the plants from those roots, and that can tell us something of what was growing there before the bog. But in particular, the one study that is unresolved is in dating, in the radiocarbon dating of peat, that the 2 main components, the humic acid and the human acid, in the early days of radiocarbon, 50 years ago, they were the humic acid was discarded as a pollutant, and it was the human was dated. Today, it is very much the humic that is dated. And the question I am raising is, what is the problem of humic acid in Turbary, where a bank of turf is cut like this? And as the bank of turf begins to dry out, what happens with humic acid? Is there an induced downward movement of humic acid in peat, so that when we come to date, let's say cutaway bog, the remnants of what's left there, has it been contaminated and made many centuries and possibly millennia younger by the movement of the induced movement of humic acid by the lowering of the water table and cutting back the bank face. So there are 3 areas of study. I would like to see the pollen of millennia looked at. I want to see the root system under the bog being looked at, and I want to see a comprehensive dating of the humic joule dates for blanket bog in Turbary areas such as here, and in particular in deserted bogs. How has the humic acid, has it moved and impacted? And the way that can be done is by getting joule dates for samples of humic and human. And I would hope that we would be able to do that over the next few years.
Seamus, thank you very much for that presentation. I was struck by the intergenerational aspect with your son and your grandson, but you've put an interesting research challenge there. So I'm sure the researchers and academics will be interested in seeing that come to fruit in the future. Before we move on, I should have said at the outset that participants should put questions into the Q&A, not into the chat box. So if you've got questions for Seamus and the other presenters, please put them into the Q&A box. Thank you. Without further ado, we'll move on to Mike Long's presentation entitled Overview of Peat Landslides in Ireland, Peat Landslides in Ireland, and Mike is from UCD, but he'll introduce himself more fully. Over to you, Mike.
Thanks very much, Pat. I hope you can hear me okay. Yeah, my name is Mike Long. I'm from the School of Civil Engineering in UCD and also from ICRAG. And I'm just going to give a very brief overview of Irish peat slides or landslides in peatland areas. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the historical perspective, focus a little bit on the 2003 slides, look at the GSI database of landslides, and then have a quick look at some of the more recent landslides we've seen in peat. And then it's just some of my own thoughts for what future work is necessary. So peat slides in Ireland are not a new phenomenon. And, you know, for example, in his 1820 poem, Thomas Begg's poem, Rathlin, a descriptive poem, he wrote, lands overwhelmed with watery peat from black Knockleda's bursting breast. So, you know, again, there, he was discussing a peat slide or a bog burst or something like that way back that time. In the historical perspective, perhaps the most well published peat slide is that which occurred in Knocknageeha in 1886 near Killarney. It's perhaps most well known because it was investigated by Lloyd Prager. I'm sure many of you have heard of him, and he wrote about it in his book, The Way That I Went. What happened there was that some people were excavating a bog. They were cutting the turf. They over excavated the peat bank. It was very high, and they exposed some very weak peat at the base of the bank. And that set off a large slide, and the peat and the water which resulted slid downhill several, maybe up to 6 kilometers, I believe, and ended up in the lakes of Killarney. And Lloyd Prager wrote, I well remember that feeling of depression with which we gazed at the black slimy mess stretching down the valley, somewhere in which lay the entombed bodies of Cornelius Donnelly, his wife, and 6 children. So I think we need to remember these things, that these things can have really profound effects. So in 2003, there were 2 significant peat slides. And these slides, I suppose, certainly in the engineering world, they rewoke interest in the topic. And the first of these occurred at Pool of Tomish in County Mayo. In fact, it was a series of slides, maybe 30 slides on some relatively steep hillsides there. And these slides were caused by a rainfall storm. I think it was 85 millimeters of rain in 2 hours and set off these slides. And the slides caused damage to buildings, cut off roads, and perhaps of most significance to the local community, it damaged a graveyard. In the same year, there was another well-documented landslide at a wind farm site called Derrybrien and in County Galway, and this one is still in the news. And here again, it occurred at a time of high rainfall, but also there were some construction activities involved in the reason for that slide as well. So those 2003 slides, I suppose, kicked off some interest in the area, and the GSI became involved. The GSI started something called the Landslide Working Group, and also they set up a database of landslides in Ireland. And that database is managed by Shirley Smith, and she's done a great job in keeping this going. So for example, up to 2018 in the database, there are 2,800 or so events, and more than half of those are in peat areas. So although we don't necessarily know the date and the details of each of those events, it's really clear that these events are widespread, and they're not just rare occurrences. So my three graphs there show the number of slides in the database per century on the left-hand side, per decade in the middle, and then per year on the right-hand side. I mean, the two left-hand diagrams suggest that the number of slides are increasing with time, but this is perhaps due to the recording or to the lack of recording of the slides. Maybe the one on the right is more interesting. That shows the number of events per year since the early 90s. And there's no clear pattern of an increasing number of slides there. You see some years like 2003, where you had a good number of slides, 2007, 2008, where we had some bad weather, and last year where there were about 6 slides. And so far this year, there's only been one to my knowledge. But there are some years where there was no slides, for example, 11, 13, 15, 17. So there was actually no slide at all. So, there's no clear pattern there. So last year, there were 3 significant slides. Perhaps the one that's most well known is this one, which occurred at the Dawn of Hope Bridge near Drumcairn in County Leitrim. It's well known because of some fantastic YouTube imagery that was posted by a gentleman called John Flynn. And here you can see it's a relatively large landslide on a shallow hillside. The landslide caused damage to roads and property and some flooding, and eventually some of the debris entered Loch Allen here on the top. We think that the landslide was initially kicked off by a small failure at the base of the landslide here, and then it progressed retrogressively uphill, as you can see by these extensional features on the bog here. And perhaps an amazing feature of the bog, of the landslide, is the way these trees floated downhill on their little rafts following a drainage pattern. There was a very similar slide at a place called Mean Bog in County Donegal. You can see the pattern of the failure is very similar. You can see that there probably was a failure at the downstream end and then progressed uphill by looking at these extensional features. The difference with this site is that the slide occurred on a wind farm construction site, and the place where we think the slide initiated is a point where there's a drain crossing the hillside, and also I think there was some road construction. And the third of these major slides was in County Kerry, in Mount Eagle and County Kerry. A bit of a different slide in this case. It's occurred in a forestry area. It occurred in an area adjacent to a wind farm, but we don't believe the wind farm was involved. And it occurred in an area where there were several slides previously. And the one which occurred last November is this eastern slide here. But there were a number of previous slides in the area. And again, the form is different from that of the previous slides, and there isn't as significant a run out as there was in the previous slides. None of these slides have been investigated in detail, and I think that work is well warranted and necessary.
2 minutes remaining, Mike.
Sure, I'm grand, yeah. So this year, to my knowledge, there's been one significant slide, and it occurred in Benbrack in County Cavan in July, again after some heavy rainfall. As reported in the Anglo-Celt newspaper here. Its form is different from the ones in Drumcairn and Mean Bog. It's actually very similar to the Pool of Tomish slides, where you see the slide was initiated on relatively high, a relatively steep hillside, and then the destabilized peat together with water just flowed downhill. And again, it will be very interesting to investigate this slide and to compare its behavior to those other slides. So just to conclude, I think, even in the 6 or 7 minutes I've been talking, these are complicated landslides, and they're complicated events. And I think cross-disciplinary work is really essential in order for us to understand them better. And I think these slides are also part of our heritage, and we need to treat them with respect. And they can have significant effects, as I've demonstrated, and there's no question in my mind that further research is needed into them. And with increasing climate change, we're going to see more high intensity rainfall events. So I think, again, that points to further research being necessary. I'm an engineer, and those of you who are engineers would know that the geotechnical properties of peat, for example, its strength and its permeability, are not that well understood. So we need to do some work there. And also, I think, and we probably will hear others speaking about this, I think remote sensing can be a very powerful tool in these circumstances. And I think you also need to talk to the locals. They're the ones who understand the terrain. And I suppose something I would like to discuss is that what should we do about planning for these events in the future? Should we try to produce hazard maps, for example? And thank you very much for your attention. Pat, I think you're muted there.
Thanks, Mike, for that. I was muted, as you said. As a one-time civil engineer myself, I'm glad that that discipline is also present. We don't hear enough about this aspect of peatlands, so thank you for that presentation. Next one is a joint presentation, if that's the right. I think it's joint, even though there are 3 people involved, and it will be double the normal length. And to remind you again, to please put your questions into the Q&A box rather than the chat. So
you're on mute there again, Pat.
this next presentation will be given by Derek McLoughlin, Paddy Crushell, and Colm Gavin, a joint presentation on peatland restoration and CAP. So they're representing National Parks and Wildlife Service, Wetlands Survey of Ireland, and the Pearl Mussel project. I think Derek is starting, so I'll ask Derek to please introduce himself, and we look forward to this presentation. Over to you, Derek.
Thanks a million, Pat. First of all, can you hear me okay?
Yes. Yeah,
thanks very much. And hello, everybody. And thanks very much for the earlier presentations as well. I must say, Seamus's work, being a Mayo man as well from the Westport side of the county, I remember lots about 1989. I remember the work that he did there and the ongoing work that he did there. And I also remember it was a year in which Mayo were also in the All-Ireland final unsuccessfully that year. Okay, so in this series of presentation, I suppose my own background is Derek McLoughlin is my name. I'm the project manager on the Wild Atlantic Nature Life IP. And I, as a trade, I'm an ecologist and so on, but I've got a big interest in agriculture and agricultural policy and broader land use and so on. So my colleagues will introduce themselves as we go on. So CAP and its role in peatland restoration. It's a fascinating topic. Excuse me, just going to work out the next slide business here. Okay, perfect. So just as a quick background, in terms of CAP, most of you will know it's quite a big piece of policy, but it's approximately a third of the total EU budget. It covers a lot of different aspects of rural development. But most Irish farmers operate under the framework of CAP itself. Most EU farmers operate under CAP. It comes along with a range of rules and requirements in terms of compliance for various payments and subsidies, etc. In an Irish context, particularly in the West and certainly across the peatland areas of Ireland, it represents pretty much close to 100% and often up to 150% of a farmer's income. When income spent and so on is taken into account, and considering that the vast majority of our blanket bogs, for example, are farmed, it is by far the biggest influencing policy in an agricultural and in a land use sense. So in terms of restoration, given sites, in terms of survey work, etc., we're at nothing unless we understand the driving policies, land use policies that operate here. The sums of money are very large, and that there'll be possibly 150 or 200 million euro per year being paid specifically for environmental measures in these areas. So it's considerable, and it's something that I'd urge people to know a bit more about, because I think there's a low level of understanding there. And in terms of restoration, we think about drain blocking, we think about grazing pressures or whatever it might be. But ultimately, That's just a response to the broader policy, and farmers are incredibly flexible in terms of and adaptive in terms of following what the policy requirements are. And what policy indications give. So we're obviously currently in the process, and Department of Agriculture are in the process of drafting the CAP strategic plan. So in this little segment, I'm going to talk about results-based programs, but particularly standing back from that, what is a suitably designed program? There's several key principles here, and here are some of them. Local adaptation, practical and results focused is something that's hugely important in these programs. Developing with those that farm these lands, that understand these lands and have lived in these areas for a long, long time. Proper funding and fair funding is extremely important here. Building on the skills and experience. Very often we think it's an evolution rather than a revolution, but it's very much tapping into the experience of those that manage these lands, farmers in these areas generally. Flexible and adaptive management is hugely important. So that means that we all have different ways of doing things. Who cares if you're grazing the hills with camels or elephants, provided the lands are in good nick? That's the bottom line there. We can get completely caught up in rules and regulations there. And ultimately it comes down to one word, and that's quality. It's trying to achieve high quality habitats, high quality ecosystem services. So trust is a huge thing between managing authorities and farmers and so on, and the capacity to be able to deliver these kinds of programs. Another enormous thing for humans, we need to have the facility to be able to improve. We can't be just told that this is we want better, but without being able to reward better. So we always have to consider that further delivery of ecosystem services or habitat quality should attract perhaps higher payments, or at least that can be adapted and can advised upon to facilitate better improvements. And also accounting for things like factors outside of farmers' control. So the results-based approach is something that captures this very, very well, and taking into account these kinds of principles. The idea simply is that higher agricultural payments accrue to higher quality habitats on the ground, generally scored out of 10. There's some really good examples of Ireland in Ireland coming from the Burren, which would be really a lighthouse program, right through the Hen Harrier Project EIP, the Pearl Mussel Project EIP that you'll hear in a moment, and my own project, the Wild Atlantic Nature Life Project as well. So it's it really has this effect of, I suppose, incentivizing farmers to improve quality, and they're rewarded by higher payments. As well as that, the idea that someone that is scoring low has the option and has the ability to improve through advice, through funding, etc., whatever that might be. It's all underpinned by really strong scorecards that are understandable by 11 or 12-year-old, by Seamus's grandson, I would say, that would be well fit to use these scorecards, but they're underpinned by strong science, simple multiple choice questions relating to structure, vegetation, cover of sagum mosses, degree of drainage, etc., that relate to points.
Derek, you've 5 minutes gone. You may need to hand over soon, I'm told to say to you. Sorry.
Perfect. Okay. Just to flick on, and my final slide is that ultimately the results-based approach invests in landowner skills. It taps into farmers. From our perspective, the pressure that we have then is landowners looking to improve habitat quality on the ground, looking to see what can we do and where can we get the resources and advice to do that. The biggest thing of all is the focus on quality rather than searching for the threats. Let's incentivize high quality and let's facilitate those to meet that high quality that currently don't. And also the delivery of, finally, I would say the delivery of multiple services here are really important. It's not just about peatlands. It can't be just about peatlands. It has to be about climate. It has to be about water. It has to be about people, economics, etc. So it's really important to have clearly well-designed programs to do that. So I'm going to pass over to Patrick Crushell here on the Pearl Mussel project, and I'll flick on the slides for Paddy. Paddy, do you want to take it over?
Spot on, Derek. Yeah, thanks very much. So yeah, thanks, Derek, for the introduction. So my name is Patrick Crushell. I suppose my background, I'm a peatland ecologist. I've been working on the Pearl Mussel project, European Innovation Partnership, for the last 3 years. We started in 2018. It's a €10 million project. It was set up, I suppose, the main aim of the project was to trial a results-based agri-environmental scheme to target aquatic receptors, so an aquatic species being the freshwater pearl mussel. The idea was that we'd trial it across a large enough area of land to see if you could upscale this results-based approach that Derek explained there, which was active in the Burren and some other local areas prior to us starting off. So just to see whether it's upscalable, but also to see how you could adapt it to an aquatic target rather than the terrestrial habitat, such as was proven in the Burren and elsewhere. So I suppose we started in 2018. It's been a bit of a whirlwind fast few years. 470 participating farmers at the moment. We would have started in our first year at 340, so we're expanding the whole time. We're running across 8 catchments, 8 priority catchments in the west of Ireland, all very much peat-dominated catchments that continue to support recruiting populations of freshwater pearl mussel. So as I say, we've 35,000 hectares of land in the programme. Atlantic blanket bog being the prominent land type, along with heathlands, uplands and lowlands included. I suppose these areas are characterised by the peatlands and obviously the very high associated rainfall, more than 200 millimetres in all of our catchments. They're all very similar catchments. So this whole local adaptation, which is really important with these results-based approaches, is that the scheme is designed in such a way that it suits the land type, but also it suits the farming practices in those areas. So we've got mixed livestock farms, typically mix of cattle and sheep. 28,000 hectares of bog and heath in our throughout our catchment. So it's a large, significant area. Might move on there, Derek. Can you move the slide? So yeah, I'm trying to remember what the next slide is.
It should be up there. Results indicators, is it?
Okay, I know it's on it anyway. So look, it hasn't moved on for me, but we have a series of result indicators on our yeah, you had it, but it's gone back. I'm doing this on purpose. So there's 3 examples there of habitat quality on the peatland. Low quality habitat, obviously it's very eroding peatland, gets a low score in our program. As Derek mentioned, we use a scorecard, Peatland scorecard in this instance, score the plots 0 to 10. Low scoring plots, less than 4, don't get a payment. But they're low quality, we feel are not delivering anything of value, therefore there shouldn't be a payment accruing, an agricultural payment accruing. There is moderate quality there in the middle photo as an example in peatland, where you still got vegetation cover, probably not in excellent condition, perhaps slightly overgrazed and pinch points throughout. So that might get a moderate payment, it's moderate quality. And then you get the higher payments going to higher quality, where you've got a high cover of the sphagnum mosses and the moss layer is still intact. So we'll keep moving there, Derek. So that's just a sample of, I suppose this is the key point here, is that we're assessing the habitat quality throughout our catchments annually through a series of trained advisors who submit the scorecards via digital app in the field. So they've submitted, as was 2,500 scorecards to us this summer, which we're currently processing and trying to relate the payment to the quality. This is just giving you an idea of the peatland quality in our catchment. These are broad categories of high, moderate and low, but you can see there's a few low scoring, a bit of high scoring land up in the higher parts of the catchment in particular, and then a lot of moderate scoring peatlands. So we'll keep moving, Derek. I suppose the value of that really is illustrated that there's so much data being collected through these programs that it has a lot of added benefits and potential uses for other land use managements and indicators of ecosystem health. So I've concentrated so far on the results-based element of the project, which is the main payments accruing to farmers. But a key aspect that I think is critical to the success of these programs is this additional budget, which is supporting actions. This is a budget that farmers can apply to get funding to do certain actions on their farm, which are targeted so that they must, before they're approved, we must approve them on the basis that they're likely to lead to an improvement in quality or an improvement in score, which in the end of the day is the ultimate objective of the program, and the farmers see the long-term benefit that get onto a higher annual payment. We can't keep paying for fencing or for drain blocking. We want to be paying for quality, and this is just a kind of a tablet or a stepping stone towards the farmer getting up onto a higher results-based payment. Examples of these include peat plugs or peat dams that we would have put in Donegal, where we would have funded this action with a farmer there. We basically went up to him early on in the program and just showed him the books and how, if he was to improve the quality of this, how he could potentially increase his payments. And I suppose a big selling point, and I suppose it's an obstacle as well, as not knowing what's coming down the line. But I think people are clear that the future of CAP is going to be looking at rewetting and sustainable management of peatlands. So I think this farmer will be on the right track once the next round of CAP come through, hopefully, if there's measures like this included in it. And it's not always about drain blocking or direct hydrological intervention. Here's just a change in land management or grazing regime can lead to improvements, and peatland restoration and the rest of it. So this is an area of commonage where we've funded the installation of temporary fencing, where the land just needed a chance to recover after a long time of overgrazing. So there's good indications that that's working out there. We're doing some hydrological research in association with it. So that's it. I think I'll move on to, I'll pass over to Colm there. Colm is a participating farmer in the Pearl Mussel program. We just thought it'd be great to hear Colm's take and his experience of participating in the Pearl Mussel program. So Colm's farming an area in the Bundura catchment, not far from Leenane, beautiful part of the land. And Colm, I'll hand over to you. There you are.
Thanks, Paddy. Can everyone hear me there?
Perfect.
So as Paddy said, my name is Colm Gavin, and I'm farming in the Bundura catchment, South County Mayo, beside Kittery Fjord, and I'm part of the Pearl Mussel project. I'm the 8th generation farming here, and I have 110 hectares of both private and commonage land. We're running Mayo Blackface, and they're for sale to stores. And recently we've tried some cattle out on the commonage, and to some success, probably more so in a conservation role. In the next slide there, you'll see my marks, my scorecard marks. So I've got a few 9s and 8s, which I'd be quite happy with. Everything's kind of working well there. But you'll also see there's a 4 and a 6. The main issues I had there were with rhododendron drainage issues and a few pinch points of poaching along the river. The next slide there, you will see, so we're putting in silt traps here. At the top of the hill there behind us is 700 meters, and it's 2 kilometers to the river. So that's quite a lot of rain coming at you in that space of time. So what these silt traps were doing was they're taking the sediment and the water, they're taking the energy out of that, and it was just depositing it there. And in times of flood and high rainfall, the drains overtop and they spread the sediment out onto the land. And we really weren't finding too much issues with the land being too wet insofar as we've seen so far. We were surprised at how quickly they filled up with sand. I suppose it is a sandstone area, all the mountains are sandstone around it. And also how quickly it recolonized with all the grasses and sedges there. But still the water still flows through, the area still dries up. So we're quite happy with how they've been. The next slide on there again. So as you can see on the picture on the left-hand side, the area is in a bit of a mess. This is where livestock were crossing. It's right beside the river. It's not really what we wanted. It's not a good look. As you can see, that's liable to flooding as well. So what we did was, it was a very simple fix. It was our own idea. We had a heavy gauge pipe left lying around. We built up around it. And this now is where the animals cross. And also, it still gets flooded, but it empties as quick as it floods. So there's no real harm. Grass is growing. It's just, it's working quite well. Other things we've done then are tackling the rhododendron. That's been a big problem in the area. If anyone's been around to Connemara or any of those places, it's a serious problem. I wouldn't say we have it eradicated at all, but we are in the process, and it's going to be an ongoing thing, and we're going to keep at it for another little while. My own thoughts on the results-based scheme.
2 minutes there, Colm.
Thanks. So the teams, I feel, need to be open-minded. Both the farmers, the project, and planners as well. They need to be open-minded as to what will work in an area. We know the place very well. We know how the land lies. Something that I might think will work, somebody else might disagree with. But just to listen, I think, is a good thing for everyone. Another thing is you are sometimes rewarded for historic practice, like not maybe turning over land, not reseeding fields and stuff like that. But you can be penalised on those too, but they're kind of half and half, I suppose. The choice of measures and the feeling of control of the actions are very important. Like, we're a long time been told what we can and can't do, and we can't do this. So we feel we have a sense of ownership on these actions, and that's so important. Just for us to take the ownership on our farm again, and it brings back a sense of pride. My own thing is the network that we're getting between the people that are out farming. Like, you can see there, that's people from quite a few different commonages all joined together. We mightn't necessarily deal with them all the time, but getting that meeting, getting that network together, I think that is something that needs to be nurtured, and that is something that I'm very, I think is really important. That is all I have to say on it. Thanks very much for your time.
Thanks. Thank you, Colm. And I'm struck by the 8th generation. That's very impressive, really impressive. A comment or two, I also want to thank Paddy, of course, and Derek, but a comment or two that struck me, Nuala Madigan earlier on said that about 70% of peatlands in Ireland are in private ownership. And then I think Derek said 70% of blanket bogs are being farmed. And Paddy and his project talked about, 470 participating farmers, of which you are the example, the example here today. And it strikes me that it's not just about communities, and we're going to hear more about that, but it's about people who have real skin in the game, owners and people directly affected. So thank you for your presentation, the three of you guys, but you in particular, Colm. One of the comments there said it's good to see a really enthusiastic farmer presenting here. So well done. Without further ado, again, to use that hackneyed phrase, we'll move on to Shirley Clarke, who will present on Monaghan wetlands for climate, nature and people. Shirley's from Monaghan County Council, and I'll hand over now to you, Shirley.
Thank you. Just let me start my... No, is that working okay?
Perfect.
Brilliant, thank you. So my name is Shirley Clarke, and I'm the Heritage Officer here in Monaghan County Council, and since 1998 I've been working to advocate for nature, and originally I worked for the ENGO sector for the Irish Wildlife Trust and An Taisce, but since the end of 2004 I've been the Heritage Officer here in County Monaghan with Monaghan County Council. And Monaghan, I suppose, is located in Ulster, and we're on the international border with Northern Ireland, which along one section is cloaked by the Slieve Bay upland blanket bog, and then to the east by a transition mire at Drumgallen. And Monaghan or Muinachon is a place abounding in boulder clay hills, which were deposited in the most recent ice age, and these created a very special environment for interdrumlin wetlands to develop, especially those lovely fen mosaics that were mentioned earlier on, to develop into the hollows. And in 2000, or since 2006, and the publication of our first county heritage plan, we've been gathering information about our wetland assets through county surveys to establish the location and category of wetlands to which these watery places fall. And in 2005, we had a list of 40 nature sites only for the entire county, listed as areas of scientific interest, which had been proposed and placed on the Natural Heritage Area list, but no systematic wetland surveys in the county had been undertaken. So Monaghan County Council, we sought to remedy this gap in information, and we started with county fen surveys, and we actually worked on a national fen survey manual with the National Parks and Wildlife Service at the time. But to date, we have a database of over 700 wetlands, and many of these have been surveyed in the field and described habitat classifications and categories of importance from local to international. We did what scientists do. We looked for evidence of existence and recorded, annotated and catalogued. This we carried out in the knowledge that there had been a huge loss of wetland habitats in the county between 2000 and 2006 in the order of 10%, a figure garnered from our very first survey, undertaken because so many local people had raised their concerns about wetland infilling and drainage during the consultation for the Heritage Plan. We published our scientific surveys online and held engaging workshops had public field trips, printed wetland posters, wrote booklets, and in 2019 published a book on Monaghan's wonderful wetlands, a cultural and natural exploration with a view to winning hearts and minds. We commissioned FTech, the environmental economists, to evaluate the ecosystem benefits derived from Monaghan's wetlands across 6 sites in 2011 to influence decision makers. We held 2 national wise use of wetland conferences, one which was attended by Christopher Briggs, the Secretary General of the International Convention in Wetlands in 2015. The planning and agricultural regulations changed in 2011 to lower the planning thresholds which trigger an EIA to be undertaken for development affecting wetlands. But still, the wetland deterioration and losses continue. The EPA has recently issued new guidance to the local authority here in Monaghan that they will not approve additional intensive poultry units due to the impact of nitrogen deposition on the Slieve Bay Special Protection Area. The national ceiling or environmental threshold has long been reached. The newest iteration of the Monaghan Biodiversity and Heritage Strategic Plan has at its very core the issues of biodiversity and climate, recognising that heritage has very little to do with the past, but actually involves practices which are fundamentally concerned with assembling and designing the future. The plan contains 13 priority themes, which were developed following public participation events and online surveys. One of these is Wonderful Wetlands, which recognises the continuing decline of these habitats nationally and their importance for biodiversity and climate change mitigation. To implement this theme, last year we commenced a process to develop a Monaghan Wetlands Action Plan and a network to make the jump from identification, listing and conservation works on Slieve Bay to a larger and more ambitious approach for the county. We were awarded funding from the department through the National Biodiversity Action Plan. Using the RAWS approach, which is the Rapid Assessment of Wetland Ecosystem Services from Ramsar, Wetland Surveys Ireland took 200 of our wetlands and assessed them for more than just habitat classification. They have been scored for their ecosystem services under the 4 headings of supportive, regulating, provisioning and cultural. And you can see one of our posters here that we've done for wetland sites describing ecosystem services. And the aim of this is to show landowners, non-scientists, farmers and funders where restoration or conservation actions can be prioritised and the services which will benefit from these actions. The final report and action plan will be published this November and will direct our work for the next few years. In the transition of our relationship with the land, since I suppose the Bible's assertion of us as rulers, through to steward, partner and participant, some communities, individuals and landowners have moved towards being participants in the Aldo Leopold philosophical sense. You can see from this attitude survey undertaken in 2021 that there is an interest amongst some of the public in wetland habitats and their understanding of the important role they play for ecosystem health and functioning. But I would say that institutions and policies are far behind, mostly still in the steward category, as resource-orientated land use and planning approaches to wetlands dominates.
2 minutes there, Shirley.
Fine. We are hoping to make a lot more progress in the near future with an establishment of a community wetland network in County Monaghan with the mentoring and support of the Community Wetlands Forum. So can we recognise the intrinsic needs of wetland ecosystems, and would that strengthen the rationale and methodology for conservation and restoration? Should we recognise rights for nature, including wetlands, before it's too late? I believe, along with many others, that a transformative approach to governance is needed based on nature's rights to protect and restore ecosystems. This comes very much from the newest understanding of ecology and ecosystem approaches, where the interconnectivity of everything is starting to be recognised. So the Society of Wetland Scientists this year proposed a universal declaration for the rights of wetlands. And I've put them out here because I think they're very interesting and perhaps something that we can look at to incorporate into our approaches. And these rights are the right to exist, the right to their ecologically determined location in the landscape, the right to naturally connected and sustainable hydrological regimes, the right to ecologically sustainable climatic conditions, and the right to have naturally occurring biodiversity, the right to integrity of structure function, and the right to be free of pollution and degradation, and the right to regeneration and restoration. Now, my over 23 years experience in this field and with wetlands and their protection, I say that these nature rights are absolutely necessary and part of the great system change needed to reorientate our human project from its devastating exploitation to a benign presence, or more radically to a positive presence. And wouldn't that be wonderful for wetlands and be wonderful for us? Thank you.
Thank you, Shirley. Certainly thought-provoking on your declaration of the rights of wetlands. We may have questions on that. So to get us onto that, we'll now have our final presentation of this session, which was from Andrew Jackson of UCD, and he'll talk to us about the legal framework for peatlands. So over to you, Andrew.
Thanks, Pat. So, legal framework for peatlands then, in terms of a basic schematic of the framework that I'm talking about, this is a hierarchy of laws, of course. You have international environmental law that's relevant, the CBD and the Ramsar Convention and the Berne Convention and so on. You have lots of instruments of EU environmental law, Habitats Directive, Environmental Impact Assessment Directive, Industrial Emissions Directive, and so on. And then flowing down into national environmental and planning law. So our national transposition of EU directives, the Planning Act, the Wildlife Act, and so on. Now, for present purposes, it's the EU and national levels is where this really bites in terms of the nitty-gritty of legal regulation of peat extraction in Ireland. By way of general context and background, of course, there has been an historical unwillingness to regulate the peat sector. This quote that I've included here is from the European Commission in 2004 in legal proceedings brought against the state, where the Commission says, leaving aside measures taken in response to these legal proceedings and certain other measures involving EU co-finance, so life projects and so on, Ireland does not evince any appreciable commitment to conserving its peatland heritage. On the contrary, Ireland's domestic policy and legislation has offered little or no effective protection of this heritage, and the actions of the state itself, up to very recent times, greatly contributed to the loss and deterioration of this heritage. Now, what does that translate to in terms of regulation? Well, arguably we have what's been described as the biggest unregulated land use in Ireland, if not in Europe, when it comes to peat extraction. We have lots of laws. We don't have so much compliance or enforcement. And if we freeze frame time on Bord na Móna's cessation of extraction, my summary of the position looks something like this. The permissions that are relevant across the top, planning permission, integrated pollution control licenses in certain cases, environmental impact assessment, appropriate assessment under the Habitats Directive, and substitute consent, which is an unusual consent, which is needed where an activity has been undertaken without EIA or appropriate assessment, where that should have been done, and a retrospective permission is possible only in exceptional circumstances. And if you look across the rows, then you can see essentially across the board, these permissions have not been obtained. Bord na Móna has IPC licenses for its extraction, although those were granted without EIA or appropriate assessment. And I've tried to categorize the extraction between large scale Bord na Móna, large scale other, and then all smaller scale extraction. And you can see no planning permissions, no environmental impact assessment, no appropriate assessment, and so on. And now that's, of course, clearly a very major legal issue and a very large regulatory failure. Beginning to close the regulatory net, of course, seemed very important and NGO site visits to bogs near Loch Derivara in County Westmeath are pivotal in this story back in 2009, following contact from a local person who was very concerned about what was happening there. And what Friends of the Irish Environment found when they went to see these bogs was what they found, of course, unpermitted and unassessed extraction. And that was simply scratching the surface of a general story, which is, as I've said, there are no planning permissions in place, no environmental impact assessment having been done, and no appropriate assessment. And again, this is the European Commission from the same legal proceedings I cited at the start of my presentation. Not a single statutory EIA has yet been undertaken as at 2004 for a peat extraction project in Ireland. Now I'm going to give a very potted history of some of the things that happened since then. These site visits by Friends of the Irish Environment led to a so-called petition, which is in fact a detailed legal complaint to the European Parliament, because the sense was that not only the government needed to be spurred into action, but also the European Commission. And this Petitions Committee process is a means of achieving that. There were 2 hearings before the European Parliament in 2011 and 2012. At the first hearing, Margrethe Auken, who's a prominent Danish MEP, called the peat extraction situation one of the worst cases of environmental damage ever to come before the Petitions Committee. That process applied pressure on the European Commission to take action. It also applied pressure on the government. So the regulatory net began to close in 2011. The Planning Act was amended such that peat extraction from September 2012, which needs EIA or appropriate assessment, cannot be exempt to development and therefore needs planning permission. So forget all the complex rules about size thresholds, 10 hectares, et cetera, if the extraction needs the EIA or appropriate assessment, it can't be exempted and needs planning. FIE, Friends of the Irish Environment, tested that understanding and asked Bord Pleanála to determine whether the extraction in Westmeath that I've referred to was exempted or not. Bord Pleanála said it wasn't exempted and needed planning permission. 2 peat companies challenged that decision, and that case ran for quite some years until 2018, when the High Court ruled against the peat companies, confirming the understanding at the top of my slide.
2 minutes.
The government
there,
then
Andrew.
moved. Sorry, was that 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Thank you. The government then moved to try to take large-scale peat extraction outside the planning permission system. And this is something that we've seen repeatedly with what you might describe as sensitive land uses, such as forestry and some types of agricultural development, where the planning permission net closes, then a move is taken to take the activity outside the planning permission system altogether. Friends of the Irish Environment then took the unusual step of directly challenging the legislation which had been made in the High Court and succeeded in striking down that legislation on the basis that the legislation provided what was described in court as an enforcement holiday, where the peat extraction could continue, notwithstanding the fact that all sides recognised that it had not been subject to impact assessment. So peat extraction then, the legislation having fallen, fell back into the planning permission and substitute consent systems that I've described. And my points at the bottom there are simply to reflect another part of the story is of course, the power stations, where in 2015, Antashka had overturned the re-permitting of Edenderry Power Station on the basis that the EIA there didn't consider the peat extraction. And then a few years later, in 2019, Bord Pleanála refused permission for West Offaly Power Station's re-permitting. So where things stand, the reason I have the spider web is because the peat extraction sector, I think, is caught in a web, but I think it's a web of its own making, because in failing to engage with the law, as should have been done, the peat extraction companies now find themselves in a difficult position, because they can't simply now go for planning permission and then apply for an EPA license. You need the planning permission before you can get the EPA license. First, they have to go through this so-called substitute consent process before they can apply for planning permission. And that is available only in exceptional circumstances. Now, just this week, the government has proposed changes to the substitute consent system, but I won't get into that now. But nevertheless, it's a series of steps that need to be gone through. In conclusion, and by way of messages, it's hard to me to envisage the circumstances in which substitute consent and planning permission can lawfully be granted for future peat extraction. And I think we need urgently to focus now on cessation of extraction and drainage, on just transition, on restoration and rehabilitation, and not on trying to facilitate ongoing extraction or trying to buy another 5 years or another 10 years, etc., etc. Another thing this story shows, I think, is the limits to what command and control laws can achieve. And that's particularly evident on the Natura 2000 side. And that points towards the value of alternative approaches that we've already heard about today. You know, co-funded life projects and results-based agri schemes. So I think we need a combination of command and control regulation, but also bottom-up large financing initiatives and so on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Certainly some challenging stuff there for the legislators and the industry and so on. We're very tight on time, so I might only take
we'll go for 5 minutes, Pat.
5 minutes, 5 questions. Okay. Let me see, what have I got here? Yeah, I've got a question actually, Andrew, I think for you. How can you regularize peat extraction given the High Court system? I don't know if it's possible to answer that, but have a go anyway, please, Andrew.
I'm not sure I understand the question. There is a process by which peat extraction could be regularized, but the peat extraction could not continue pending the regularization. So that's clear. But that, of course, doesn't fit with peat extracting companies' plans. And that's the nub of the issue. How can you regularize peat extraction given the High Court system? I'm not sure I understand the question as such, but you can only regularize peat extraction lawfully. People have the right to challenge decisions in the High Court. And where decisions are successfully challenged in the High Court, that's not just because it's not because the High Court disagrees with the original decision. It's because the original decision was illegal or unlawful. So peat extraction can only be regularized lawfully, and it can be challenged in the High Court and can be overturned on the basis that any decisions in the chain were unlawfully taken.
Okay, thank you for that, Andrew. I think this one is for you, Shirley. The question is, have other local authority heritage officers used the RAWS approach at all?
No, not that I'm aware of yet, Pat, but when we have our report issued in November, we're going to be sharing it with all the heritage officers and the methodology with everybody so that it can be replicated around the country to whomever wishes to use it. If that's a good answer.
I'm sure it's perfect, Shirley. Thank you. A question for our three amigos. I think it's in relation to the CAP presentation on restoration from Katrina Douglas, actually. So Katrina is wondering whether recovery of heather on upland heaths where it has suffered depletion is also included as a target in RB APS.
Yeah,
So,
hi, Pat. Yeah, hi, and thanks, Katrina. Yeah, ultimately, vegetation structure is something that's captured in that, specifically where issues accrue on a given site. You know, maybe perhaps a more bespoke approach is needed on a site-by-site basis. But generally, from a vegetation structure in the scorecards, that's the idea where something like that will be captured.
very good. And Mike, if you're still there, Mike, have bog slides occurred in other countries similar to ours?
Yeah, absolutely, Pat. You know, certainly in the UK, and I'm aware of one that occurred in Norway last summer, and certainly some in Canada as well that have been researched. So we're not unique, I don't think.
Very good. And finally, I think this one is back to Seamus. And the question, Seamus, is, do the archaeological questions justify the carbon peat extraction? Could there be more sustainable options for assessing the concerns?
Well, the amount of carbon extraction that takes place, I see that there has to be a particular balance. That the amount of that once you have a termination of commercial cutting of peat, that the amount that is being cut domestically, in particular any that is being cut by hand, is very much the approach. I would see a certain validity in the Finnish approach, where it is seen that peat extraction for domestic use is a very slow renewable energy. It's the use of a very slow developing renewable energy. But that in areas, let's say you take North Mayo, I will see that there is far more carbon being captured in North Mayo than there is actually being put back out by people by domestic cutting. But I agree absolutely with the idea of terminating the commercial cutting.
Thank you, Seamus. And I'll finish with this question because I think it gets to the nub of the ownership and the community aspect again, and it's back to maybe Derek. The question is, or maybe Paddy, how difficult is it to get landowners to agree to block property boundary drains, and how are you able to do this?
Yeah, that is a big challenge, and it would obviously need the agreement of both landowners either side of that property boundary. To date, we've only had success really with internal drains within individual landholdings, but it would really depend on the site specifics of it, what the motivation is of the farmer. Yeah, it's a challenge. I mean, I think the Farm Peat project, which is going to be working in the Midlands, it's probably going to be a bigger challenge there than maybe in some parts of the West, where there's kind of much lower land areas in adjoining fields. So I think you're talking about cooperative actions, possibly of a number of farmers coming together and agreeing to go this route. If the market is good enough there, the incentive is there for them to consider it.
Okay, thank you, Paddy. And look, we'll wrap up at that. Can I first of all thank Ray Flynn? Ray, like Morris in the last session, was the unseen, unheard note taker. So I'll thank Ray on all our behalves. Also, thank all the presenters, Seamus, Mike, Derek, Paddy, Colm, Shirley and Andrew, and all the participants. And just to inform you that this session ends now, you'll have a break, and the next session will start at 2:15 p.m. So thank you all.